This is an interview for the online journal artcornwall.org. Hello and welcome. Today we have David Tovey, art historian, who's mounting exhibitions on the developments at Penlee House. David, can you tell us the actual name of each of the exhibitions?
Yes, well, they go under the umbrella title of Dawn of a Colony, and the Tate exhibition is called Picturing the West, looking at St Ives art between 1811 and 1888, and the Penlee exhibition is called Lyrical Light, and that looks at art in St Ives from 1889 to 1914.
So initially one supposes it was the figure of Turner who visited St Ives. Did he actually paint anything when he came to St Ives?
No, he only actually did a pencil sketch in his notebook from the top of the Stenach. So he didn't really produce a major work of art in St Ives at all, but his name is always mentioned as the start point for St Ives art.
Who was the actual next major figure on the scene?
Well, the next major figure covered in the exhibition is Edward William Cook, and there is a connection between Cook and Turner because Turner's depictions of the Southwest were engraved by Edward Cook's father, George, and his uncle. And I think it's very likely that Edward Cook would have grown up knowing Turner's visions of the Southwest and would have been tempted to have come down to have a look himself. And he came on a tour in September and October 1848, and we have in the exhibition two sketches by him, one dated 11th of October, one dated the 12th of October, on what was then known as Carrick-Gladden Cove Beach, which is now known as Carbis Bay.
So these were mostly pictures of seascapes, is that right?
He did a number of different sketches. These actually are showing fishermen working on the beach in Carbis Bay. His major work, though, was a painting called The Pier and Bay of St Ives, Cornwall, which shows the harbour in St Ives with a number of vessels up with their sails up, so it's obviously been raining. And this was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1853 and was sold to the Lord Mayor of London for the enormous sum of £294.
It was the railway that came to St Ives, I believe, in 1859. Did that have big effects on things?
It had a big effect on the whole of Cornwall. It's the key date in the discovery of Cornwall by artists. And so, for instance, in the exhibition catalogues of the Bristol Academy, which was probably the major venue at which West Country artists exhibited, in the years between its formation in 1845 and 1859, there are only 2 paintings of Cornwall a year on average. In 1860, there are 15. That shows you how dramatic the influence of the railway was. And one of the artists who first came down to St Ives as a result of the rail link was the Royal Academician James Clark Hook. And he, in fact, spent 2.5 months in St Ives in 1860, and 3 of his Royal Academy exhibits of 1861 are actually St Ives subjects. One of these is in the exhibition. It's called Compassed by the Inviolate Sea, and it shows Daniel Perkin and his wife Mary on the cliffs at Cloggy with a view out over to Godrevy. A second of his Royal Academy exhibits from 1861 is in the exhibition as an etched version, and that shows a couple of boys on a mooring block fishing in St Ives Harbour. So this was probably the longest visit in St Ives prior to the early 1880s.
Right, so after this then, which was the first major art school that was actually founded in St Ives?
Well, art schools were not really founded until the 1890s, but what is clear is that in 1888 the landscape painter Adrian Stokes produced a major work called Upland and Sky, one of the first oil landscapes done in Cornwall, and this was the result of his experiences training in France and he attracted down to St Ives a number of budding landscape students from the rest of the country, particularly from the Herkimer Art School at Bushey. And so artists like Arnesby Brown, Greville Morris, Algernon Talmage and Arthur Mead were all Bushey students who came down to learn landscape painting under Stokes's guidance in St Ives in the late 1880s, early 1890s.
St Ives is always associated with a particular kind of light. Do you think that was very important for that stage?
Yes, I believe that it was something that attracted the artists, and I think there is a key difference here between St Ives and Newlyn. Both are on the Penwith Peninsula, which is a narrow strip, and therefore often it's been said in the past that it's the light reflecting off the clear waters of the ocean, which have got no sediment because they've come straight across the Atlantic, and bouncing across this narrow strip of land, which causes the special light. But why it was so special in St Ives is the presence of the four white, hard, sandy beaches in the middle of the town, and the light reflected off the sand crystals much more than it would have done at Newlyn, and that's why the light in St Ives was particularly special.
The conventional view seems to be that people like Whistler and Sickert were really important to the development of the community, but as I understand it, there were figures from Europe, in fact Scandinavians, who came and were very important on the scene. How does your view angle in on this? What exactly is your particular take, if you like, on the development?
Well, the visit of Whistler has been given considerable significance in the past, and I think the problem is that people have mixed up the significance of Whistler's paintings and the exhibition at which they were shown at Dowdeswell's in London in May 1884 in the general British art historical context, with the influence that that visit had on the establishment of the art colony. One can certainly argue that Whistler's paintings and the way in which he exhibited them in London is very important in a British art context. I don't think his visit had any significance at all in relation to the establishment of the art colony in St Ives. And what is quite clear from the artists who did settle in St Ives in the early years of the colony is that they all came from Brittany, and they all had friendships which they had enjoyed in Brittany beforehand, and one of them actually says that the person who really discovered St Ives was actually a French artist called Émile Louis Vernier. And Vernier seems to have painted in St Ives in the early 1880s. He also painted in Concarneau, and it was from Concarneau that the first group of artists came to settle in St Ives, and these were Henry Harewood Robinson, an English artist, and his Irish wife, Dorothy Robinson. They were joined in 1886 by a party of Americans led by Edward Simmons, and that party enjoyed themselves so much in St Ives in 1886 that they came back in 1887, told all their friends what a wonderful place St Ives was, and so we get this extraordinary listing of artists by Howard Russell Butler in 1887, when there are far more foreign artists in St Ives than there are actually English artists. And this does lead to an extraordinary international flavour to the colony right from the outset, because all these foreign artists had come over to Europe to study in France, and therefore when they did their paintings of St Ives, they exhibited them at the Paris Salon. They did not exhibit them at the Royal Academy. And so St Ives gained its initial reputation in Paris. Paris was full of art students from all around the world who saw these paintings and decided that they'd like to come to St Ives as well. So it was an extraordinary beginning for the colony.
This is an interview for the online journal artcornwall.org. As I understand it, there were also writers and architects, and were there photographers at this time?
Well, in the early days of the colony, it was principally artists, but a number of artists also did take photographs as well, and I think a number of artists actually used photographs in their paintings, particularly some of the marine artists, who in fact gets references to some of the American marine artists buying paintings of John Christian Douglas, one of the photographers, and using them in his work. And the artists also had an impact on the development of the town, and one of the artists, Edmund Fuller, was actually employed as an architect to build some of the new homes that the artists were wanting to live in by the turn of the century. When they had become much more confident about their future in St Ives, they decided to build massive homes, and so properties like Dunvegan and Tremorna on the cliffs at Carbis Bay were actually designed by the artist Edmund Fuller.
I understand as well that the fishing lofts must have provided possible studios.
Well, it's at the outset really any industrial building that was out of use, and there were quite a few of them because St Ives was really in quite some trouble economically at the mid-1880s. Any industrial building that permitted the insertion of a northern skylight was very much in demand. And, for instance, Howard Russell Butler talks about the fact that he discovered a rope loft on Porthmeor Beach, and he said that that was the very first Porthmeor studio, and he was astonished when he came back to the town 9 years later in 1895 to find that there were 24 studios fronting Porthmeor Beach. He had created the first one in 1886. And then there was a strange music pavilion in near Trewin, which was used by Helen Scherfbeck as a studio. This had plaster figures on its ceiling. And then the old mine engine house on Pendolver Point, that was converted into a studio by Eardley Blomefield. There were properties in St Andrews Street that were used as studios as well. So really all over the town, artists found various spots that they could use as studios.
I'm trying to get some sort of picture of the sort of social class of the people involved. Were they very much gentleman artists?
Well, that's always the perceived opinion, that these artists were middle to upper class people with their own income, which meant that they didn't really need to work, they didn't really need to sell paintings. But my researches into the censuses show that actually some of these artists came from very poor backgrounds. Some were the sons of poulterers, upholsterers, fishmongers. Okay, there were also sons of bishops and sons of army generals, but they weren't all of that class. And I think it's wrong to assume that all artists were from wealthy families.
Can you tell us a bit about the sort of life that they lived at this stage? I mean, was it a very bohemian lifestyle? How did they relax and unwind? Were they did they go to pubs and so on?
Well, there was a variety of entertainments. I think, to begin with, one of the reasons why these colonies actually formed was that whereas the artists wanted to get away from the mass populace of the towns, they nevertheless didn't want to find themselves stuck on their own in the middle of nowhere with no entertainment. So that's why they tended to group together, and they tended to have dinner together. They would be able to entertain each other after dinner with songs and reminiscences. And certainly in St Ives, one learns as early as 1888 that Louis Greer, who had taken the Folksall studio on the wharf, was having parties of up to 60 people on a Saturday night, include men and women, so women artists were included as well, and they would play charades and they would sing. And there were some fine musicians amongst the early artists. Henry Hayward Robinson was very well known for his love of and expertise in English 16th century music, and was a composer. Wiley Greer was a fine tenor voice, and Louis Greer also took part in the number of dramatic entertainments. So they did get themselves involved in the local community, And in fact, the first ever exhibition of art in St Ives, which was in November 1887, was put on for the benefit of the Choral Society. And you find that many entertainments are put on by the artists for the benefit of a wide range of charitable activities in the town.
It sounds a very interesting sort of atmosphere at the time. And you say that women artists, you mentioned Helen Schefferbeck. Who was she, and which other women artists were involved?
Well, amongst the early artists, there were 4 women who had all trained together at Collarossi's atelier in Paris. This was Marion Prendelsberger, an Austrian who married Adrian Stokes, Helen Schefferbeck, a Finnish artist, with her Finnish friend Maria Wieck, and a Swedish artist called Emma Lostadt, who married the American Frank Chadwick. And all 4 of these artists were in St Ives in 1887. And it was because Marion Stokes invited Helen Schefferbeck over in 1887, because Schefferbeck had won a travel scholarship, that she spent 6 months over here. And she produced one of the seminal works of her career, of her early career anyway, in St Ives. It was a painting called The Convalescent. And it featured a young girl who was painted often by both Marion and Helen, who apparently was so naughty at school that her teachers were only too glad when she stayed away as a model.
So by now they were painting portraits, and were there still lives?
Helen Schefferbeck did do a few still lifes, but to be honest, in the period prior to 1914, still life didn't really feature very much in the genre of the artists, the output of the artists. We find that most of the early artists who settled in St Ives in the early years were actually figure painters. And it's only as the 1890s progress that we find that St Ives starts to develop its reputation as a landscape and marine centre. And this obviously was greatly assisted by the establishment in 1895 by Julius Olson and Louis Greer of the St Ives School of Marine and Landscape Painting. And this was very unique because really these genres were not taught at other art schools around the country. And so to have an art school that concentrated on these 2 types of painting, that concentrated also on painting out in the open air as opposed to in the studio, and also concentrated on the teaching of values, which was something that was taught in France but not so much in England. This led artists from other art schools all around the country to come and study in St Ives. So we find students, even at the Slade School in London, come down to St Ives because it has something different to offer.
What kind of values are we talking about here? It sounds quite interesting.
We're talking about colour and tonal values. The whole basis of the system of landscape and marine painting in St Ives, which Adrian Stokes really introduced into the St Ives group, was drawn from the Barbizon School in France, and he talks about a meeting with the Barbizon School artist Charles Daubigny, who said that what you need to do is you need to look at your values, you need to look at your lightest light and your darkest dark, give one 100, give the other 0, and adjust all others by reference to those. And similarly with your tones, you look at your coldest tone and your warmest tone, give one 100, give the other 0, and adjust all others by reference to that. So you have this harmonious whole. So it was very much a tenet of the way in which St Ives developed as a centre for landscape painting.
Another figure that my friends say was important, although I've not heard of him myself, is Julius Olson. Is that correct?
Julius Olson was a key figure, yes. He became Britain's most well-known seascape painter, and he actually was a self-taught artist, and I believe he was very influenced by Adrian Stokes in his early years. He really came to prominence in St Ives around 1900, and he produced a series of wonderful seascapes which relied very much on very colourful depictions of foaming breakers, and these had a touch of romance about them. But at that stage, the Victorians really didn't appreciate pure seascapes. They wanted a dramatic incident in their marine paintings, and so Olsen very much blazed a trail that others could follow by making this sort of pure seascape acceptable at the Royal Academy.
This is an interview for the online journal artcornwall.org. Now, David, you've obviously been researching this very deeply now for, 15 to 20 years or so. What discoveries have you made on the way, and what have you learnt from them?
Well, there is something new to discover every day. When I set out on this particular project, which 5 years ago, I've obviously looked at it before, but this in depth, I've been looking at this for the last 5 years. I envisaged that most of what was to be said about early St Ives art had already been mentioned, even if not gone into in any great detail. What I've uncovered over the past 5 years has just been extraordinary. And my original one book on the subject has now extended to 3 huge volumes. And so there is just a mass of new discoveries that are there waiting for people to read about when they get round to it.
So where do you find the information for this sort of thing? Does it come out of places like, I don't know, the Morib Libraries? How much of it's textual? How much does it involve reading the paintings themselves?
Well, there's a huge number of sources. I mean, St Ives is very lucky in the amount of source material that it actually has available. The local paper, which started off as the St Ives Weekly Summary and Visitors List, is a fascinating source, and I go back through it time and time again. It not only has articles on the art colony, but you find the artists mentioned in all sorts of other different ways. And then it has this strange thing, the visitors list, which between May and October every year, it lists who was staying in the town. And this is so important now, because you look through these lists and it's an exceptionally boring process, but you suddenly find that there's a name of an artist that you're researching who's staying for several months in the town, and suddenly that leads you on to finding out about his work. Now, you can link up this with also the fantastic records that there are at the St Ives Arts Club. There is a visitors book there where members and their guests have to sign in, so that alerts you to who are members, who are visiting during the winter months when the visitors list isn't being produced. There are also things like the library book in the Arts Club, which tells you who's taking out books. That's very useful as well. The suggestion.
One particular commercial property that seems to be quite important was Lanham's. I was reading about it in Patrick Gale's novel just last night. Is there anything valuable to be gained from researching Lanham's?
Yes, if one could research Lanham's, it would be invaluable, but unfortunately I don't think there's a huge amount of source material available. But yes, I mean, Lanham's first of all supplied the artists with their paints. Apparently, according to Arthur White, Whistler said to James Lanham, "Look, I can't get any oil paints anywhere nearby. I've got to send to Cambridge for them. Can't you sort it out?" And so Lanham arranged to get some oil paints in, and then he supplied them with canvases as well, and then he started letting their studios and packing up their pictures in packing cases to send off to Paris and all around the world eventually. And basically everybody couldn't exist without the sort of things that Lanham's did for them. And it's very interesting, one of the most recent pieces of research I did concerning an artist called Louis Sargent, who was of a very nervous disposition, and he came down to St Ives because he wasn't really very well, and it transpired that he became very ill when he was in St Ives, and James Lanham took him into his own house and cared for him. So that's yet another aspect that one hadn't heard about in relation to James Lanham in the past. He was obviously very well liked and an absolute boon to the artistic community.
How have things changed by the end of the century? I mean, I understand that Virginia Woolf would have visited the town by then. I think she was quite a frequent visitor to Talland House, but I can't, or at least I don't know of any great connections. I mean, her sister obviously was a painter, but would you have melded into the background somewhere?
Well, Virginia Woolf was actually in town before the artist colony was actually formed, and they left in 1895 when her mother died. And there are accounts of the artists actually socialising with her father, Leslie Stephen, at Talland House. And he, in one of his letters, Leslie Stephen talks about the fact that he's rather surprised that they've actually now got an art gallery in town, and that was obviously the one that James Lanham set up. So yes, there was some involvement with Virginia Woolf, but she was quite a young girl at that stage, and it was clearly, though, the involvement with the artists in the colony that made Vanessa Bell decide to become a painter.
That's really interesting to hear about. I was just wondering, how do you go about collecting the pictures for this exhibition? It must have been a huge job.
Well, there are paintings by many of the major artists in art galleries around the country. I had probably more difficulty with the paintings for the earlier exhibition, and I ended up having to buy quite a few of them myself, because the problem at the moment is that there is actually no gallery in Cornwall that sets itself out as promoting St Ives art and collecting St Ives art, because the Tate St Ives has no remit to collect. So the only gallery that's interested in buying St Ives art occasionally is Penlee House, and they have just bought a wonderful Helen Schöfbeck painting and also a William Eadie painting, which will be on show in these exhibitions this summer. But in general, there is nobody actually championing St Ives art, and so if you want to make certain that a painting is going to be available for an exhibition, you've got to buy it yourself.
Now, I'm struck by the fact that that in Falmouth at the moment, I think there's an exhibition of Henry Scott Tuke. I just wondered, did people move around from, say, Falmouth to St Ives and Newlyn to St Ives, or was communication quite difficult in those days?
Well, I think they did move around quite a lot, and they did fraternise with each other quite a lot. I mean, one of the very interesting things about the very early days of the St Ives Art Colony is that in 1886, so we're talking just 6 months after the colony was formed, Stanhope Forbes and his new fiancée, Elizabeth Armstrong, decided to spend the summer painting in St Ives. And so they spent between July and September 1886 in St Ives. Stanhope Forbes then decided to have a St Ives subject for his major Royal Academy painting of 1887. And so he was back and forth to St Ives all the time, or over that winter. And this led to a great deal of fraternisation between the colonies. The St Ives artists went over to watch the Newlyn artists perform in various plays, and they came over and looked at each other's work. And a lot of Newlyn artists came and painted in St Ives as well during that early period. And then, of course, in 1887, a number of Newlyn artists also were based in St Ives, and this led to the infamous cricket match between the two colonies, which occurred in September 1887, which ended very sadly when two Newlyn artists, in trying to catch the same ball, smashed each other in the face, and one of them had to be carted off to hospital.
Now, your second exhibition at Penlee, that's from 1889 to 1914, is that right?
Yes. Yes, this really has several different themes to it. In the period between 1889 and 1894, which in 1894 there was this major Cornish artists exhibition at Nottingham Castle Museum, which I call the greatest exhibition of Cornish art ever, because it contained 220 6-foot canvases, which I don't think will ever be put together again. And
sorry, what size was that?
6 foot.
Wow.
So it was an absolutely massive logistical exercise, let alone the fact that there were so many of the paintings. So in the period up to that date, the St Ives artists found it very difficult to establish a separate identity for themselves in Britain. They had made this international reputation in Paris, but in Britain they were labelled by the London critics as Newliners and as members of the Newlyn School. And this was very frustrating for them, because they wanted obviously their own separate identity. And the critics at that stage were quite happy to call landscape and marine paintings Newlyn School work, whereas now we tend to think of Newlyn School as being mainly figure painting. So this has been one of the reasons why the early St Ives artists have struggled to be recognised in recent years, because all the accolades that have been given to the Newlyn School have been assumed to be given to the Newlyn residents and not the St Ives residents. But what happens in the latter part of the 1890s is that the St Ives landscape and marine section begins to come to the forefront, and we have the schools of painting which attract new young blood down to the colony, and we find St Ives gaining an international reputation as a centre for landscape and marine painting. And this was particularly helped by the arrival in St Ives in 1903 of an American artist called Elmer Schofield, who used to spend 6 months of the year in America, and he loved St Ives so much that he would tell all his American friends to come and visit and paint in St Ives. And because he was on very many juries in America, he would manage to get his St Ives friends hung, particularly at the International Exhibition at Pittsburgh. And so St Ives artists win an extraordinary number of awards at Pittsburgh, which was probably one of the most prestigious exhibitions of the age in the decade up to 1914. This, coupled with some very highly regarded American artists also exhibiting Cornish works in America, led to St Ives having an astonishing profile in America prior to the First World War, which is demonstrated very graphically by the fact that in the summer of 1914, that fateful summer, there are 50 American artists working in St Ives.
In general, what do you hope that people will take away from looking at these two exhibitions?
Well, I fear that early St Ives art has been so neglected that people just don't have any knowledge of it at all. And I hope that it opens their eyes to the fact that St Ives was, right from the outset, of international importance in the art world, and that there's all sorts of individual artists and separate themes that need to be explored further. This is just a taster, despite the fact that we have two exhibitions happening at the same time, that we have 100 years of St Ives art being covered. It is just a taster, and there is scope for many, many more exhibitions in the future. And one of the great points that is occurring this summer is that the Tate in St Ives has, for the very first time, decided to put on an exhibition of St Ives representational art. And so people in St Ives who've been complaining for the last 15 years that they haven't been having that sort of exhibition need to demonstrate that they want that exhibition, and they need to support it. And with some great support from local people, hopefully many more shows of this sort of nature will be put on in the future.
That sounds really great. What other background activities will there be? There are lectures and workshops?
There is due to be an international symposium which is going to be held at the Porthminster Hotel on the 4th of July, which will involve the leading expert on Helen Schöfbeck from Finland, from the Finnish National Gallery, Lina Artola-Moorhaus, giving a talk on Schöfbeck. It will also include the leading American expert on Elmer Schofield giving a talk on his importance in relation to St Ives art, and I'll also be talking about the art schools in St Ives, particularly those run by Julius Olson.
David Tovey, thank you very much for that interview, and we're all looking forward to seeing these two exhibitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.